Today we're going to talk about solving equations. We're going to be looking at the basics of solving equations, and it's going to relate to something I call a do and undo chart. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's look at a situation where our equation has already been solved. So let's look at this situation. 2 times 5 plus 3 equals 13. So, when we think about this, let's think about the order we would solve this, or to check to see if it's really 13. Well, the first thing that we would do is we would multiply 2 times 5, and we would get 10. That was the first thing we did, so in my do column, I'm going to put times by 2. Now, the next thing you have to do to get your final answer is you have to add 3. So 10 plus 3 is 13. So I'm going to write add 3 in my next do column. Now if this were an equation and we didn't actually know that number 5, we would be able to solve it by looking at the undo column. Now undo means use opposites. What's the opposite of adding 3? Subtracting 3. What's the opposite of timesing by 2? Dividing by 2. So now let's look at this situation with an unknown. Let's look at it with a variable such as, say, x. And now let's write it as an equation. 2x plus 3 equals 13. Now since this is basically the same, we can use our same do-undo chart. Looks like the first thing that was done is times by 2. And, yep, that's exactly what was happened here with x. The second thing that was done is adding 3. So again, it's just like before. Alright, my other slide was getting a little bit busy, so I went ahead and moved to another one. We said that we times by 2 first, and then we added 3. So if we're going to talk about undoing this, we're going to need to subtract 3, and we're going to need to divide by 2. Now, in an equation, you would do one direction and undo to actually solve it. So let's go ahead and let's test our theory. I'm going to draw a line down the equal sign, because remember, when you have an equation, you need to get both things on the equal sign equal. It's balanced. So everything I do on one side, I need to do on the other side. So let's use our undo chart going bottom up. The first thing I need to do, it says, is subtract 3. So I'm going to subtract 3. Now, keep it balanced, so subtract 3 on the other side. 3, or plus 3, minus 3 is 0, so they cancel each other out. 13 minus 3 is 10, so I can do that math. Now let's see, on the left-hand side, those canceled out, and we were left with just 2x. So first step of our undo column is done. Now let's look at the second thing we said we needed to do. The second thing was divide by 2. So I'm going to divide by 2 right here. Now remember, to keep it balanced, we're going to have to divide by 2 on the other side as well. Okay, well 2 divided by 2 is just 1, so I don't need to write them anymore. And what I'm left with on that side is x. 10 divided by 2 is 5. So what I'm left with on that side is 5. So x equals 5. We solved our equation using our do and undo method. So now let's look at another couple examples. So here's the next equation we're going to look at. X divided by 4 minus 5 equals negative 6. Let's start out with our do and undo chart. So, again, let's look at our x. X divided by 4. The first thing was divided by 4. Minus 5, well, that was our second thing in the do column. So to undo, we're going to need to think about opposites. I'm going to change colors to make it really obvious. Undoing minus 5 is adding 5. Undoing divided by 4 is timesing by 4. Now that we have this thing ready, we know do goes in the down direction, undo goes in the opposite direction. Let's use our undo column to solve our equation. Alright, so the first thing in our undo column is adding 5. I'm going to add 5 to both sides. Negative 5 plus 5 is 0, so they cancel out, and I'm left with x divided by 4. On the other side, negative 6 plus 5 is negative 1. Alright, let's go back to our do-undo chart. Looks like the next thing I need to do is times by 4. Now remember, because this is an equation, I need to times by 4 on the other side as well. 4 times divided by 4 makes 1, so I can cancel those out. That means I'm left with x on that side. Negative 1 times 4 is negative 4, so x equals negative 4, and I'm done. This next example looks a little bit different. 7 minus x equals 13. If I go into my do and undo column, do and undo chart, the first thing that's done to x isn't really obvious. I'm minusing x. That's minus what though? So whenever you see an x that doesn't have a number in front of it, you can go ahead and you can write a 1 there, because that's really negative 1x. So when I go to my do chart, I see that I multiplied it by negative 1. Now the next thing is also kind of tricky. I have this 7 hanging out there. Now, just because the number doesn't have a sign in front of it doesn't mean it's not positive or negative. Think about regular numbers whenever you're counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those numbers, you don't have to say positive. They just are positive. So this is really a positive 7. So in my do chart, the next thing that's there is a positive 7 or a plus 7. Now, to undo, we're going to need to think about the opposites. What's the opposite of a positive 7? A minus 7. What's the opposite of timesing by negative 1? Dividing by negative 1. So let's follow our do and undo like before. Let's go in the opposite direction, and let's try to solve this thing. Draw your balance line, and according to your undo chart, the first thing that needs to be done is subtracting 7. So I'm going to subtract 7 from both sides. Positive 7 and a minus 7 is 0, so those can cancel out. You're left with negative 1x. On the other side, we have 13 minus 7. 13 minus 7 is 6, so negative 1x equals 6. Now go back to your do and undo chart. This is the next thing I need to do to undo is to divide by negative 1. Divided by negative 1 on both sides. Negative 1 divided by negative 1 is 1, and so I'm left with x on this side. Those cancel each other out. On the other side, 6 divided by negative 1 is negative 6. So we are done. We solved our equation for x equals negative 6. I just keep on throwing more and more crazy equations at you, but if we use our do and undo chart, we'll have no problem. This one follows a little bit of a different pattern. If we were to read this, we would say x plus 1 divided by 2 equals 8. Well, you just did your do and undo column right there. X plus 1, so the first thing was plus 1. Divided by 2, that's your second thing in the do chart. So to undo, we need to do the opposite. To undo divided by 2, we have to times by 2. To undo plus 1, we have to minus 1. So let's go ahead and follow our undo backwards, and let's solve this equation. Draw your balance line. First thing I need to do is times both sides by 2. 2 times divided by 2 make 1, so they cancel out. Now what I'm left with is x plus 1 equals 16. Alright, go back to your do and undo chart. It looks like the next thing I need to do is minus 1. Minus 1 from both sides. And we are left with, those cancel. 16 minus 1 is 15. On the other side is x. So our final answer is x equals 15. We're going to try one more with our do and undo chart, and then we're going to see if we can't do all of this in our heads as well. So let's look at this equation. I'm going to read it and write in my do column at the same time. Negative 4x, negative 4 times x, minus 3 equals 13. So as I read it, I filled in my do column, and now I can fill in my undo column. Opposite of minusing 3 is adding 3. The opposite of timesing by negative 4 is dividing by negative 4. I'm going to follow this pattern to solve my equation. Okay, so according to my undo, I need to add 3 to both sides. Cancel. I get 16 on this side. I get negative 4x on this side. According to my undo chart, the next thing I need to do is divide by negative 4. So I'm going to divide by negative 4 on both sides. Negative 4 over negative 4 is 1, so they cancel. I get x equals 16 divided by negative 4, which is negative 4. Now I said we're going to do things a little bit different in our next example, but I want to talk about what that means with this one. Negative 4x minus 3. The first thing we did was we added 3, so we got rid of the thing the furthest away from x. Then we canceled out. We got rid of the thing that was next to x, and once we had x alone, or isolated, we ended up with negative 4. We're going to use that principle to help us solve our next one. Alright, so here we have 3 minus x divided by 2 equals 12. We're going to use the idea of getting rid of everything that's not x, and I'm going to start with the furthest thing out. I have a 3 here. Remember, that's a positive 3, so the opposite would be minus 3. So I'm left with negative x over 2 on this side because these cancel out. On the other side, I'm left with 9 because 12 minus 3 is 9. Now again, oh, I see I have that 2 down there. That's not x. I need to undo divided by 2, so I'm going to multiply by 2. These cancel each other out, and I'm left with negative x on this side. And then I have 9 times 2, which is 18. Now remember what we talked about a while ago. We said, oh, negative x, that really means negative 1x. So this is negative 1 times x. So to undo that, we just need to divide by negative 1. Both sides, remember. Those cancel out, and we have x equals negative 18. So we basically did our do and undo without having to write out the chart. This one probably looks a little bit familiar. It's pretty simple. X plus 5 equals 2. So when I go ahead and solve, when I undo, I need to get rid of the things that aren't the x. And to start with, I'm going to start with this plus 5. Minus 5 from both sides. So plus 5 and minus 5 cancel out because they're 0. We're left with x equals 2 minus 5, which is negative 3. Now let's look at our x. Is x alone? Yeah, so we're done. X equals negative 3 is our final answer. Alright, this last example we're going to look at is a little bit bigger, so I'm going to do my do and undo chart at the same time as I read it out. If you don't need to draw one, that's fine, but it certainly helps you avoid any mistakes. So 2x minus 1 divided by 5 equals 7. So you saw as I read it, I filled in my do column. Now let's do the undo column. Divided by 5 means times by 5. Subtract 1, opposite is add 1. Times by 2, the opposite is divide by 2. We're going to use this order to help us solve. So I'm going to go over to my equation. I'm going to draw my balance line. And according to my undo chart, the first thing I need to do is times by 5. Even without your chart, you see the 5 is the furthest thing away. It's the thing that's not most unlike x. So we need to multiply both sides by 5 to undo that. So I'm left with 2x minus 1 equals 7 times 5, 35. So let's go back to our do and undo chart. I need to add 1. Well, I can see that. It's furthest away from x. So I need to get rid of it. Get rid of it by using opposites. Minus 1 plus 1 is 0, and I'm left with 2x on this side. 35 plus 1 is 36, and so I have 2x equals 36. So the last thing on my undo chart makes sense here. I need to divide by 2. Because 2 divided by 2 is 1, and I'm left with x. 36 divided by 2 is 18. So x is alone, x equals 18 is our final answer. So these are the basics of solving equations. You can use a do and undo chart to help you do this, or you can kind of just do the do and undo chart in your head. No matter what, our goal is to isolate x.